When I drew nigh the nameless city, I knew it was accursed. I was traveling in a parched and terrible valley under the moon, and afar I saw it protruding uncannily from the sands as parts of a corpse may protrude from an ill-made grave. Fear spoke from the age-worn stones of this hoary survivor of the deluge, this great-grandmother of the eldest pyramid, and the viewless aura repelled me and bade me retreat from antique and sinister secrets that no man should see, and no man had ever dared to see. At long last, I have returned with more Lovecraft. The Nameless City, written in January of 21st, that's the 19th variety, but rejected by magazines until finally being released by the Wolverine in November of the same, is by many said to be the first story in the very grand world of the Cthulhuverse. Lovecraft himself liked the story rather well, despite its lukewarm reception, and on that point I must agree with him. It is concise, and unlike many of his other works, very easy to understand. A very general overview of the plot, without touching too much on spoilers, is that our unnamed protagonist, what a shocker, travels to an ancient city in the Arabian desert, laid untouched for millennium, and here finds a truth so shocking it haunts him for the rest of his life. If that sounds interesting to you, then you should read this story. And let's be fair, every Lovecraft story, because that's what literally all of them are about. It's only 5,000 words long, roughly, about 10 pages, and like all other Lovecraft works, available online. A link will be in the description. All that boring shit out of the way, we are now approaching spoilers and needless bullying of Lovecraft territory. So this is your one chance to click away and read the story for yourself. While you decide whether or not you will do that, I am going to get a little more comfortable. That's better. And this is apple juice. Our main protagonist might be familiar if you have read any Lovecraft story ever. That is, of course, a heroic, learned, no-name self-insert to bolster Lovecraft's ego, whilst the man himself was a homebody with severe anxiety, who never left his home, let alone his country. There is a reason nearly all of his stories were placed in Arkham, a city closely based on the cities that he had known, and when he ever wrote of something outside that scope, it is noticeable how poorly traveled the man was. Prime example being this very story, which is set in Araby. Where in Araby, to be exact? No clue. Could be anywhere from Iraq to Yemen. There is nearly no way to say for certain, besides the fact that it's a desert landscape uninhabited by humans. The fact that he compares it to the pyramids of Giza, which are not by any stretch of the imagination a part of Arabia at all, further solidifies that he truly had no clue what he was talking. Remote in the desert, the city lies, touched by time immemorial, buried under sand blown in the millennia span. Its builders so old to have passed from the land before ever the city was named by living man. The ruins bring nothing but dread to those who pass it, and the old men telling its story can only tell of how it's been dead, for no civilization can remember it as alive. The tribes shun it, the secrets within too terrible for any man. Such our protagonist finds it, musing, as Lovecraft characters are so wont to do, of the mad poet Alhazred, and how he had dreamed of the city the night he had cried forth the cursed couplet, that is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. The couplet is what truly ties the story into the Cthulhu myth, the mad poet being a very central character in many of the stories found therein, but here remains unexplained. Lovecraft, as we all know, did both invent old tropes and then somehow managed to overuse them all at the same time. So, as the main character explains so clearly, he had spoken to the locals, trope, and they had warned him away, trope. But he did not listen. Trope. And the locals were proved right. Trope. If you want another trope, his gut feelings had made him wary of his find, and only his need for knowledge spurs him on to find the secrets the city hide. Though for now, he rests outside the city. Now, before I carry on, I will lend to you all a secret. This book has the most brilliant example of foreshadowing I have encountered in a book, and I challenge you all to try and pick up on it as we move on in explanation. Our brave, but ultimately foolish protagonist waits outside the city for dawn to break. And as he waits next to his camel, he observes the city in its ancient splendor. And though the weather is fine and calm, a wind rustles the sand within the walls of the town to small dust devils. In his state of exhaustion and tangled fear, he sees the sun rise, and here I will quote. Then suddenly, above the desert's far rim, came the blazing edge of the sun, seen through the tiny sandstorm which was passing away, and in my fevered state I fancied that from some remote depth there came a crash of musical metal to hail the fiery disk, as Memnon hails it from the banks of the Nile. My ears rang, and my imagination seethed, as I led my camel slowly across the sand to that unvocal place, that place which I alone among living men had seen. And so he enters the city, in the early grey of the morning, in hope to tell something of the men who had once lived in this forgotten land. He wanders from house to house, digging, shoveling, hoping with faltering confidence to find anything to prove that mankind had once stalked these streets. The proportions of the ruins, the dimensions of old built things, he felt unwholesome in some unplaceable way. As night again falls, his quest for knowledge met with nothing but a feeling of discomfort he cannot place. He feels a chill that hounds him from the city, a fear born on the wind that has started to blow the sand about him. And he leaves to sleep outside the walls, the world without still and quiet. He wakes at daybreak, not sure what woke him, but for a ringing in his ears, as from some din. But the city is empty, and the world quiet. As he once more enters the city, one of the small sandstorms he had observed was just petering out in the growing morning sun. For all his digging, he could find no more artifacts than the day before, and when he at noon rested, he wondered about the city's grandeur. He speaks of other ancient cities, those of Sarnath and Ib, that I have made videos on before, and he wonders about their fall. These thoughts still roamed his mind when he later in the day finds a cliff, and upon the face there appears to be several houses or accommodations hewn from the very rock, and his hopes ignite that he may now find the pieces of precursor lore which he has not yet found. Within the mouths of these man-made caves, he found what he had wished to find. He saw it was a temple. A curious temple it was. He could not kneel within, the roof so low, and rough carved stone showed rites so terrible he could not bring himself to repeat it. Typical, really, for Lovecraft, but I suppose the unknown is the scariest. He found yet another temple in the cliffside, and explored within this too, to find it looked much the same. The roof and altars so low he could barely kneel, let alone stand, and he explored with his torch in the dark until he heard his camel roar with fright, and rushed out to see what had scared it so. Outside, night had fallen, and a great wind was howling through the area, though when he looks up on the top of the cliff face, he sees that on the top there is no wind, and that it is all centralized to the bottom of the cliff. This understandably frightens him, but the wind turned out to come from the maw of another cave aperture, and his curiosity made him attempt to enter. But the wind almost extinguished his torch during the attempt, so he was forced to wait, and so he did, until the wind at last petered out, and he was able to enter it into the largest of the caves he had entered so far. Here he could stand upright, though only barely. For all the room's height, the altars was still low, as in the other rooms. Are you starting to notice a pattern yet? As his torch suddenly flared in the draught, he could see the aperture from which he thought the air must have come. A small, roughly hewn, chiseled doorway. And as he thrust his torch within, he could see stairs leading sharply down into the abyssal depths beneath the city. Now, as you might have picked up from previous stories I have covered, no one can accuse a Lovecraft character of acting with any degree of sense or self preservation. They naturally tend more towards states of being, such as moving the plot forward. So, with the singular goal to move the plot forwards, he, he descends the steps. Mind you, even if not a single thing was amiss, even if this wasn't a horror story, why the fuck would you do that? Let's assume, for a moment, that the age of the city is correctly reported. What could in any way make you think those stairs are structurally sound? Not to mention the continued freak natural phenomena he has observed, or the fact that for 2 consecutive mornings he has been woken by loud noises permeating from the ground. There needs to be nothing supernatural going on. Loud noises from beneath the ground could be caves collapsing, it could be rock falls. Why enter the underground? No matter though. Despite the manifold reasons not to descend the steps, he no less decides to descend the steps. The steps are very peculiar. They're steep, like a ladder, and he describes it in this way. I lost track of the hours and forgot to consult my watch. Though I was frightened when I thought of the distance I must be traversing, there were changes of direction and of steepness, and once I came to a long, low level passage where I had to wriggle my feet along the rocky floor, holding torch at arm's length beyond my head. The place was not high enough for kneeling. It's a good quote, but I like the quote that follows even more, just for how ridiculously retarded it is. After that, there were more of the steep steps, and I was still scrambling down interminably when my failing torch died out. I do not think I noticed it at the time, for when I did notice it, I was still holding it above me as if it were ablaze. He what? He didn't notice? Let's carry out an experiment for the sake of argument. And we see here that the whole scene in front of us is illuminated by this single candle. Just the way our protagonist only had his single torch. And if I just, yeah, that got dark. And I don't know about you, but I noticed, actually. Let's turn the sun back on. Around this time, the stereotypical Lovecraft madness is starting to set in full force, and the stereotypically vague protagonist reveals he knows by heart several passages from Alhazred, whole passages of the apocryphal Nightmares of Damascius, and rattles off line by line of the Image du Monde by Gautier de Metz. Is any of this important? No. It's more to illustrate the madness both of the protagonist but also quite clearly of Lovecraft. And such it carries on until he comes upon flat floor under his feet once more. Here he found a low-roofed corridor lined with wood and glass. Never mind that glass was invented only 4,000 years ago, quite a long time after Egypt, which has been described as being significantly younger than this city. And never mind that the glass of the time was not the smooth panes we know today. So recognizing lumpy clumps of indifferently smelted sand as panes of glass, in pitch blackness, might I add, seems like a stretch. The wood and glass formed several boxes along the walls of the corridor, which implication would tell us is coffins. A funny phrase here uttered is that he tried to move one for further examination. What kind of examination did he think he would carry out in the pitch blackness that he couldn't just have done with his hands where they stood? Don't know. He somehow observes, in pitch blackness with no torch, that the corridor is long and proceeds to flounder ahead rapidly in a creeping run that would have seemed horrible if any eye watched me in the blackness, crossing from side to side occasionally to feel on my surroundings and be sure the walls and rows of cases still stretched on. But somehow, through whatever arcane magic Lovecraft wielded, this isn't even the dumbest sentence in this paragraph. That honor we go to, and I quote, "Man is so used to thinking visually that I almost forgot the darkness and pictured the endless corridor of wood and glass in its low studded monotony as though I saw it. It gets better, and then, in a moment of indescribable emotion, I did see it." What? That's not how. That's so stupid. I don't I don't even have words. Following this epiphany of modern science that allows you to see in pitch darkness, the darkness gives way to some sort of undescribed phosphorescence for plot reasons. Because now he can finally see with his own eyes instead of with his human instincts or whatever. That the cave is not some mean, roughly hewn thing, but a monument of the most magnificent and exotic art. But the queerest thing of all this is the residents of the coffin. Not crocodiles, not seals, but some mix of both, and of other things not seen by any human ever before. As usual, Lovecraft seems to have misunderstood how adjectives work, because he somehow follows its perfectly good explanation of how these look by saying, "To convey any idea of these monstrosities is impossible." Lovecraft, I don't know how to tell you this, but you just fucking did. The protagonist, of course, thinks these mummified remnants are a form of god worship. Sensible enough, if this wasn't a horror story. He sees painted on the wall an epic story of the city, about how it had been a seaside metropolis before Africa rose from the oceans. But what? Wait a second. Hold that thought for a fucking minute. Rose from the ocean? Is this some part of African history I wasn't aware of? Sometimes I wonder to myself if Lovecraft had even heard of the concept of school, because sometimes it's really, really obvious that he never went to one. But no matter, I'll go with it. Not once in any of the paintings is there illustrated a human form of any kind. Only the strange lizard creatures he had seen in the caskets. He thinks, reasonably enough, that it must be metaphorical. I think this is a horror story. From here on, it's just an insane rant, honestly, with rare occurrences of anything at all actually happening. He finds a door, a massive one, of brass with fanciful bas reliefs, and from behind the door is where the odd phosphorescence came. And in the paintings closest to the door, it tells of some underground utopia, shrouded always in a white mist of phosphorescence. I wonder what that could possibly be based on. Now, do we all remember what happens every morning and every night in this city? That's right, the wind picks up, and the wind certainly does pick up in the little cave. He is nearly pulled clean off from the ground and into the white mist, and into whatever horror waits beneath. The wind beats him close to madness, and gibbering, he shouts out, in perfect parallel to how the story began, "That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange eons, even death may die." And as he screams out the couplet, over and over the wind seems to answer in a voice of its own, cacodemoniacal chanting in response to his gibbering. And there is no possible explanation better than what Lovecraft writes himself. And here I quote, "I have said that the fury of the rushing blast was infernal, cacodemoniacal, and that its voices were hideous with pent-up viciousness of desolate eternities. Presently, these voices, while still chaotic before me, seemed to my beating brain to take articulate form behind me, and down there, in the grave of unnumbered eon-dead antiquities, leagues below the dawn-lit world of men, I heard the ghastly cursing and snarling of strange-tongued fiends. Turning, I saw outlined against the luminous ether of the abyss, that could not be seen against the dusk of the corridor, a nightmare horde of rushing devils, hate-distorted, grotesquely panoplied, half-transparent devils of a race no man can mistake. The crawling reptiles of the Nameless city. And as the wind died away, I was plunged into the ghoul-pooled darkness of Earth's bowels, for behind the last of the creatures, the great brassen door clanged shut with a deafening peal of metallic music, whose reverberations swelled out to the distant world to hail the rising sun, as Memnon hails it from the banks of the Nile." And such the story ends, in such perfect parallel to the start of this very same story. The repetition of the couplet, and the repetition of how the sun is hailed, like Memnon hails her at the banks of the Nile. These repetitions, they give the story its very soul. Never mind the fact that the person who we just saw get killed by lizard people somehow wrote this all. Don't think about it. And that also caps off this video. And I must say, I am proud of myself, finally finishing it after promising it 3 years ago. A little end note for you here. The most astute amongst you might have noticed that this isn't actually Arabia. And since it's not Arabia, it's getting really cold. So I'm gonna go home. See you for the next video in like 3 years or whatever.